Great to catch up again with the Nationals Senator Matt Canavan. Matt, how are you going?
Good, thanks, Ricky. Yourself, mate?
Wonderful, thank you. We have been having, as your party has been calling for, really since the federal election, a nuclear conversation about the place of energy in Australia's nuclear mix. You had some plans to proceed on that front, but things have been sidelined somewhat for a very important reason in federal parliament in Canberra.
Yeah, that's right, Ricky. Look, I am intending to put in legislation to remove the ban on nuclear energy. As you say, this week we postponed Parliament in respect of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's passing. We'll get back to that when we get an opportunity. We're very, very unique as a country, one of the very few countries in the world that actually have an explicit ban on nuclear energy. In fact, of the 20 largest economies in the world, we're only one of 3 that doesn't have a nuclear power station, and Saudi Arabia is building one, and Italy relies a lot on nuclear energy from France. So we're a real outlier in that respect, and it's kind of crazy being the world's largest uranium exporter, and so supplying the fuel to the world for nuclear energy, but actually banning it here in this country. So all my legislation will do will just simply remove that ban. Any nuclear power station would still have to go through a huge amount of environmental approvals and be regulated by the nuclear regulator, so that it wouldn't automatically lead to something. It would just let us start to consider it.
Now, when we looked at the history of this ban, we had a legal expert on this front explain how this sort of came into place and all of those things you've just mentioned about how we're an outlier in the energy mix in developed economies she went through. But that was put in place, I guess, by the Greens or precursors to the Greens back sort of decades ago. What chance would your bill have of getting through the Senate when you've got the mix that we've got in the crossbench in the Senate now?
Yeah, there's no immediate prospect, as you say, because we've got the Senate controlled by the Labor Party and the Greens, and both of those parties effectively have a block on that. But it's important, I think, to progress this debate. If I get the bill, I will get the bill introduced, and I'll try and send it to an inquiry, and so we can start to think and consider about this, and really make the Labor and the Greens party defend the decision. As you say, the ban came in place almost by accident. It was actually a deal done with the Australian Democrats at the time, with the Howard government. At the time, the Howard government needed to get approval to rebuild the Lucas Heights reactor, which had been getting old and needed a new one. And to get the Democrats' support for that, I should explain, that's a nuclear reactor that produces nuclear medicine in Sydney. So we have a nuclear reactor, but not for power. But to get the Green support for that, the Australian Democrats' support for that, the Howard government agreed to ban nuclear energy. At the time, there wasn't really much consideration of nuclear energy, so it seemed like a relatively cheap concession to give away. But now we have a situation where our coal-fired power stations are being shut down. Renewable energy can't provide reliable power. The rest of the world is going back to nuclear in the US and in Europe. But now we're left with this ban that restricts our options.
When you mention, I guess, the reason we're shutting down coal, you're an advocate for coal yourself. I mean, where does this sit in the net zero debate, the push to allow nuclear energy to be considered for Australia?
Well, the simple reality is if you want to get to net zero, you can't do it without nuclear energy. Sun and solar and wind just cannot provide power 24/7, and those countries that have tried to do that, like Germany, are in a complete and utter mess. The energy crisis in Germany is hard to exaggerate right now. People may have seen that Germans are searching for the term firewood at record rates right now because they know they're not going to have enough energy over winter. It's a terrible situation for a developed country to be in. A large part of the manufacturing industry is also shutting down. So that's the future if we just rely on renewables. And if you want to get rid of carbon emissions, nuclear becomes your real only other option. As you say, I still think there's a role for coal-fired power in the interim. Germany does. They've reopened 21 coal-fired power stations now. They're going back to that. But we should also consider nuclear. And the thing with the nuclear energy for our country is it will take some time because we don't have a nuclear energy industry. We don't have the supply chain set up. We don't have the regulators all ready to go. So it will take a lot of time. That's even more reason to start considering that now, rather than just keep kicking this can down the road like Germany's done, and we leave future Australians with diabolical options.
But isn't some of that energy crisis because Germany and much of Europe had hitched their wagon in an energy sense to Russia, and they've got problems with this geopolitical situation with Russia at war in the Ukraine? Has this caused the whole world to really rethink their energy dependence on places like Russia?
Absolutely has, and keep in mind, it's not just dependence on Russia. I mean, in some respects, what Russia is doing is what Greta Thunberg and the radical Greens want. I mean, Russia's cut off gas to Europe, And we've been told by the Greens constantly, reminded of them by them of this in their dress wear to the midwinter ball last week, that we should kill off coal and gas. And so for all Putin's barbarity in Eastern Europe, his actions have actually been in line with the Greens in terms of energy, at least. That's what they want to do. Now, we can see exactly what happens when fossil fuels are cut off from developed countries. They go into darkness. They go into absolute crushing increases in electricity prices. It is a complete and utter disaster. We cannot move away from fossil fuels anytime soon. We need gas, we need coal to do basic things in our society, not just create electricity, but that's a big important one, but also create a range of plastics and other products. All the personal protective equipment we use during COVID, from masks around through to gowns in surgeries, they're all made from petrochemical products. The world runs on these things, and we've got to get back to hard reality about how the world works. They'll end up in the vulnerable position Europe finds themselves in today.
Speaking of Greta Thunberg, she seemed to have gone into hiding for a while. I haven't seen her, but she's re-emerged recently at protest rallies in Stockholm, for instance. But yet this call for, the net zero, etc., I notice in Europe, they've reclassified nuclear as effectively being green and something they can legitimately go to reach that net zero target.
That's right, Ricky, and they actually put gas in that category as well as green as well. Fossil fuel is green. It did cause Greta and her ilk to go into hyperspace, but it shows, as you said before, the world is moving back to these technologies because the hard reality and limitations of renewable energy have become so apparent. In California, another bastion previously of green energy, their governor has delayed the closure of a nuclear power station there. In the UK, the new Prime Minister has come to power saying she will seek to build a new nuclear power station and end the ban on fracking. And getting back to that Russia point, it's become absolutely clear and evident that a lot of the anti-fracking protests, possibly ones that Greta Thunberg has been involved in, maybe unwittingly, she didn't know maybe, but a lot of evidence has emerged that Vladimir Putin Russia has been funding those anti-fracking protests. And why wouldn't they? Because if they can stop other countries developing their own gas resources, that'll just create more money for Russia.
Now, just looking back on the Australian domestic stage in the Parliament itself, the federal government is moving to create this net zero bill. The Liberals and Nationals voted against it. Why?
Well, we just think it's unrealistic to put this in legislation. We need to have a situation where we respond to circumstances like we're seeing in Europe. On the government's own admission, the Labor government's admission, they didn't need this piece of legislation. It's completely ineffectual. All the bill does is say our Paris target commitments are net zero emissions by 2050 as well as the 43%. But it locks us in then to those and doesn't give us the flexibility we may need to respond to issues like, say, if China invades Taiwan. That's not a remote circumstance. So why put this in legislation, which may make any future government's ability to respond to changed circumstances very, very difficult? And I still think we have our head in the sand here, where we're making it harder for our local manufacturing. Remember all the talk of bringing manufacturing back during COVID? It's not going so well now because we're obsessed and focused on this net zero agenda, which is pushing up energy prices. Now, we don't have the same crisis Europe has just yet, but wholesale electricity prices in Australia this year have gone up 4 or 5 times. It is crushing our manufacturers in this country, and it will continue to do so until we focus again on producing reliable and affordable energy.
But is this bill driven largely not so much by the crossbench in your Senate, but by these new teal independents? The Albanese government barely hangs on to a majority because those independents are there. Is this really driven by, I guess, ticking a box after the election, the government's doing something on climate change?
Well, look, the Labor government did take this to the election, so that's why they want to do it, and they want to deliver an election promise. Just won't do anything for people. It won't lower electricity bills, etc. But we went to the election opposing such targets, and the Labor government were elected on the lowest vote in history for an incoming government. Just 30%, just over 30% of people voted for the Labor Party. So they have no mandate, and it's right and proper for us to put our position forward in the Parliament, which is this is the wrong approach for our country, because we should be putting Australians first. We should be focusing on redeveloping our industry in the face of very volatile times in our region.
Well, Senator Matt Canavan from the National Party, thanks very much for joining us today, just outlining what you intend to do and keep us in the loop when you do actually get to table that bill in the Parliament.
Thanks very much, Ricky. Have a good day, mate.